I had absolutely no intent to mention the fact that today, Easter Sunday, is also April Fool's Day. But it appears that I've fooled myself. So I'll fess up right off the bat. That was not the gospel reading I was intending for today. There were two choices, and that just shows that my proofreading ability is declining. This one is short, so if I can impose upon you what my thorough just said, it's all good news, okay? So I am going to read the one that might make some sense in the context of the sermon that I'm about to present. This is from the Gospel of Mark, Mark's telling of this resurrection story. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. 3 women walked briskly through the pre-dawn streets of Jerusalem, through the city gate toward Golgotha and the nearby tomb. Their task was urgent. After their dear friend died on Friday and was placed in the donated tomb, it was too late, as sunset and the beginning of the Sabbath was imminent. So now they hurry. Baskets of spices and oils, clean, soft cloths, to prepare him properly for his burial. It was the least they could do for this one they had come to love, this one who had suffered right before their eyes such a brutal and undeserved death. They talked softly as they walked those dark, unfriendly streets, worrying about how they might get past any Roman guards, wondering how they would move that great rock rolled across the tomb's opening. Back within the city walls, in the upper room, one man sat off in a corner alone. It was his second night without sleep. He barely heard the deep, soft hum of the others' voices. His heartbreak was just too painful. He had denied his best friend and mentor not just once, but 3 times, even after Jesus had predicted it, even after he, Peter, had insisted that he would never, ever do such a thing. Oh, what a coward he had been. What a poor example to the others. No wonder they had all run away in fear. Fear. Such a human, paralyzing emotion. Who doesn't fear death or pain? The unknown, the unexplainable, separation and rejection. We might understand why the disciples had run off after Jesus' arrest. Their own risk as his companions was real. They too might find themselves arrested and nailed to a cross. The women, though, walked the path and stood there through it all, just a short way from the cross. Perhaps their risk was not so great as it was for the men. But they watched and they waited. They saw Jesus die. Then they made sure they knew where his body was laid. Their fear kicked in for them on that early morning after the Sabbath when they discovered that the tomb was empty. There were no soldiers guarding it. There was no large stone blocking its entrance. There was no body to anoint and prepare. Only a young man dressed in white with astounding news. He has been raised. He is not here. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And then Mark leaves us right there in the women's fear as they fled. Terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The end. Oh my. Imagine if, indeed, that was the end of the story. None of us can just leave it there, though. Even the early Christians were not satisfied, and they wrote other endings. But most biblical authorities agree that those were added and not original to Mark's gospel. But yet, how could we possibly be sitting here celebrating the resurrection 2,000 years later if that had been the end of the story? If the women had told no one? And yet, the young man directed them, just go and tell, meet Jesus in Galilee. And we must assume that they did so. Even if Mark gives us no evidence, we don't have a story of the presence of Jesus after the resurrection, no appearances, no teaching after he is raised. We're left hanging, maybe grasping for the other gospels' logical sequence of events that leave the disciples and followers equipped, that let them watch as Jesus ascends to God. Nice and tidy. Mark's gospel began with the words, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It does not end, though, with the end of the good news. For after the last period of his pen is not an end, but a new beginning. That new beginning is even starting as the women flee in terror and amazement. And it will continue as they find their voices, as they start to recall Jesus' teachings, as they tell the others, and the realization dawns about what meeting Jesus in Galilee might mean for them. I hope that when the women's voices returned, when they went back to tell the disciples, that they quoted that young man in white verbatim. The part about, go tell the disciples and Peter. I hope that Peter heard his name and was assured that he was still included in spite of his denial. This is a new beginning that will require all of them to carry the story on to the ends of the world without Jesus' physical presence. They will be the bearers, for there is still much work to do. They're not going to find the Roman Empire gone. They're not going to find all illness and injury cured, all poverty and hunger and injustice abolished. They're not going to find the promised reign of God fulfilled, nor do we. For they and we must be part of its realization. Galilee awaits, the world awaits, we await. New Testament professor Carolyn Lewis tells us, the resurrection was never the end of the story because we are called to see beyond it. No settling on the promise of new life when your life doesn't show that you believe it. No assumption of new life if you routinely reserve it only for yourself. No taking the resurrection for granted if you don't make a way for others to be resurrected from their current and certain deaths. The resurrection was never the end of the story. It couldn't be. It's our story to keep living out, remaining vigilant in our witness when bodies continue to be left in the mass graves of complacency and compliance. To speak up when others try to leave the promise of the resurrection in the past. To resist when the powerful would try to deny that death has been overcome for all. Resurrection means little, she continues, if it is only for which we wish and has little to do with how we live. Resurrection won't matter if it stays in the confines of history or remains only a future hope without showing us a present hope in witnessing resurrection on a daily basis. It is in that present hope that we know that Jesus lives. And we know that because he lives, we too shall live. Live and keep the story alive, not just in our hearts, but in our actions, in our love. We may experience the presence of the risen Christ right here among us when we gather and worship, but not just here. We may experience Christ's presence when we meet each other in town, in our homes, in the hospital, when we feed the hungry, care for the sick and the imprisoned, welcome the stranger, and tell the stories, carrying the joy and the hope of the resurrection right out of these doors and into the world in every way we can. That is the good news. Death has lost its sting, and so has life, as desperately as it continues to need healing. Alleluia, Christ is risen.